Greetings everyone, and welcome back to Natural Horror November, where I'm hijacking Anatomy of Fear to talk about my favorite genre of horror. So we've covered a lot of ground so far, and with only a few episodes to go, I hope you're enjoying this discussion so far. If I've succeeded at nothing else, I hope it's getting horror fans to be laser focused on the budding new pantheon of natural horror that speaks specifically to modern issues. I really believe that today's topic is a subject that might not have the extensive history of other topics that we've covered, but it definitely has legs. I really believe this genre could be huge. Maybe even as big as the slashers of the 80s and the paranormal movies of the last decades. Okay, maybe not that big, but definitely big. When we think of natural horror, much as it pains me to say, a lot of the nature run amok type stuff might have mostly run its course. Modern audiences have modern appetites, and the notion that all of nature might one day turn on us despite being a very compelling premise might not be nearly as impactful as the ones we're going to be talking about today. That's because isolation horror is by definition much more personal. When most of us think about nature attacking us, the scenario we actually play out in our minds is most likely an isolation horror film. In most circumstances, we would be perfectly safe. We probably have someone to call, like the sheriff, the Department of Game and Wildlife, Animal Control, Allstate, someone. We also benefit from the fact that in reality, most animals, even the very threatening ones like sharks and bears, really don't want that much to do with us. Sharks in particular don't find humans to be worth it most of the time. They tend to pick at us at first, if at all, just to see if it's worth the fight, and if any of us have even just a little bit of fight in us, we could easily persuade such creatures that no, we really are not worth the effort to eat. And yet, on some level, we also take it for granted. Sometimes nature is hungry, and sometimes there ain't nobody around to protect you. Even the most skilled hunter can become food if the circumstances are not in his favor. If he's malnourished or tired, or has no place to hide, or is out of ammo, or any of a number of things, he will be in trouble. This episode's all about the films in which this is 100% the case. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and while humans might ordinarily be at the top of the food chain and holding all the cards, sometimes that's just not the case. This is the scenario we all dread. It's why we don't go in the water, or travel to an uncharted territory where even your sat phone might not work. There are places, even in the continental US, where one will not encounter any services for miles. The longest stretch of highway with no services in the United States is US 6 in Nevada, between Ely and Tonopah. Most of the time, you would have little to worry about, but for 167 miles on this stretch of highway across some of the least hospitable desert, you'd better be prepared. Sat phones are a great way for many explorers to have backup protection, but you may not realize that they're actually banned in a lot of countries, including China, Cuba, and North Korea, and they're restricted to government-controlled networks only in many others, such as Russia and India. Many places on Earth are only accessible with an experienced guide, such as the Himalayas, the Amazon, and the Australian Outback. Many of the films in this category begin when a group's guide is eliminated, leaving the group entirely vulnerable to the elements. Some of these stories emphasize the arrogance of people that feel they don't need help in order to brave the elements, but soon learn the hard way that that's just not the case. More often than not, though, they're merely in the wrong place at the wrong time. Indeed, the variety of scenarios in which a person is placed entirely at the mercy of nature in a way that removes all possibility of either assistance or escape is simply endless. And that's what sets these films apart from other natural horror films, the helplessness of total isolation. It's knowing that whether you even know where you are or not, help ain't coming and you ain't leaving. I actually think there's 3 different modes that these films operate in. I don't want to call them categories or types because most of them use these modes interchangeably, moving from one to the next as it suits the story. Nevertheless, if we are horrified by isolation, it is exploiting one of these 3 things: exposure, disorientation, and confinement. Being exposed simply means the person is vulnerable to the elements, along with whatever else is lurking in the woods or the sea or wherever the person may be. As anyone who's ever read Sun Tzu's The Art of War knows, there are many tenets to survival that depend on your position with respect to your threats. Always get to high ground, always fight with the sun at your back, and always avoid open spaces. The most obvious example of exposure is a film like Open Water. It's hard to think of a film where its characters are more exposed than that film. There's nowhere to go, and no way to get there if they could. and no way to defend yourself. Being stranded in the middle of the deep sea is about the most exposed one could possibly be. Of course, exposure can also refer to the actual elements, which make one increasingly vulnerable the more one is weakened by them. Disorientation doesn't help. Essentially, this just means being lost. Even if you're armed to the teeth and free to move about as you please, if you don't know where you are, then you're at the mercy of whatever creature's turf you're on. Being lost also drains your resources and your energy, which can do half the work for whatever's trying to hunt you. Most isolation horror films, though, capitalize on the third mode, which is confinement. Being trapped in one place with something that wants to eat you is just no way to spend a holiday. This is the easiest type of horror film to make and may be the least creative, but it still has the power to turn out some really great classics when done right. Confinement is also the most popular because of all the myriad ways a person can become trapped. In a way, open water is a type of confinement too. The couple's free to swim away, they just won't get very far. That's the problem. They're not technically trapped, but for all intents and purposes they are. Confinement just means you're unable to escape your situation. Now, unlike the other episodes I've done so far, I'm not going to go through each of these one at a time. I just want to state those three modes and then just start going through examples. As I said, many isolation films use a combination of these three things, so I don't even think of them as types. At the end of the day, these are all circumstantial horror films. They're not universal stories that could apply to everyone, like a zombie movie or a slasher movie, where anyone can easily put themselves in the same time and place. Isolation horror films can have universal appeal, but they work best as a what-if. They have a niche quality to them. Not all of us have been spelunking or scuba diving or extreme rock climbing or any of a countless number of endeavors. So the what-if proposed is more akin to a gothic Dracula-type story which takes place in some far-off exotic place with mysterious names like Transylvania. For this reason, if I was to come up with types for isolation horror, I would call them either exotic or domestic. In the former, one finds the danger by looking for it, and in the latter, the danger finds you. Open water is a good example of the exotic, whereas movies like Crawl and Cujo fall into the domestic category. Domestic isolation horror films, without a doubt, can have universal appeal. You don't have to imagine yourself off somewhere doing something dangerous to find yourself trapped in a similar manner. Thrill seekers of all stripes may identify with exotic horror films even if they don't partake in the particular activity of the film, but almost anyone can see themselves trapped in a house or a car with something that wants to eat them. The difference comes down to whether the character at some point asks on the one hand, what the hell was I thinking? Or, on the other hand, what did I do to deserve this? These seem like two completely different questions. I'm not saying that all these films fall neatly into these two categories, but these are interesting ways to think about them. At this point, man already has some sense that if he ventures off into nature and gets bit, he has no right to blame anyone but himself. But if nature comes to him and punishes him, and no one else, like a tornado taking this house but leaving the one right next to it intact, he'll be tempted to ask, what the hell for? What did I do? The answer to that question is what makes these films so fun and interesting. Sometimes it's just timing. It was you because you were here. Other times, there might be some moral or spiritual or some other reason why this happened. The great thing about natural horror is that you can't really blame nature for doing her thing. So that just leaves our poor character to search his own soul to determine if he will accept his own doom or fight. Maybe he'll get lucky and maybe not. Isolation horror in some ways is the purest kind of natural horror. It doesn't have to be global in scope, or encompass a large geographical area, or feature mutated species or a byproduct of reckless science, or some other meddlesome thing of man. Sometimes natural horror just means one unlucky girl on one tiny rock and one very hungry shark. So to start, I want to talk about the second of these two types. This is the oldest type that I know of. I'm sure you can find countless examples of isolation in horror films if you go all the way back far enough, but near as I can tell, isolation in horror is a very recent phenomenon. As I said, the animal run-amok films of old have largely run their course, but they were the feature presentation of natural horror for a good long while. But like the birth of the slasher replaced the Draculas and mummies of the studio era, creatures that came from far away and had a mystique to them, horror simply took on a more relatable and less unimaginable form. It seems that people don't scare easy anymore. Some things we once thought were terrifying now seem a bit hokey, and that's a good thing. It means horror will always be redefining itself and finding new things to scare us. In the second episode, I talked about all the ways in which animals are actually entering our cities and eating our food, because they can. You can bet that these stories will happen more frequently. Exotic and wild animals on the loose in metropolitan areas, growing pest problems like sewer rats, cockroaches, and all the little creatures we assume are manageable, but may one day prove to be far less so. And so, it's not far-fetched to imagine a scenario where little old you is going along about your business, only to find some apex predator in your kitchen. However, I think it is present and future films that will capitalize on this basic reality. If you go back, though, near as I can tell, it's not until the 1980s that we get a film about an animal terrorizing its heroine in a situation of involuntary isolation. I feel like I've got to be missing some great films out there, and if you know of any prior to this that feature isolation in a domestic setting, or any setting really, I would love to know. The closest I could come to would be The Long Weekend, the Australian natural horror film from 1974 that I talked about in episode 2. Although dealing with themes of domesticity, the film is basically about abortion and a failing marriage. It involves a couple going out into nature. They seem to get lost before they get there, and when the wife decides she's had enough of the outdoors, and of her sorry excuse of a husband, she cannot find her way back. That and its remote setting might make it a precursor to isolation horror, but of course, that would assume that The Long Weekend is a movie that anyone even knows about. It's hard to call that influential. It's hard to call The Long Weekend an isolation horror film, though, because while the setting is indeed a character in and of itself, and nature is pretty menacing in the film, the horror doesn't really seem to come from any sense of being trapped in this place. You could argue that this is true from the wife's perspective, since she doesn't really want to be out there, but most of the attacks seem directed at the husband, and she doesn't really even attempt to leave until almost the end of the movie. So setting that film aside, the first isolation horror film has got to be Cujo. It's not surprising, though, when you think about it. If you had told the studios that you were going to make a movie about a dog terrorizing a woman and her son, they probably would have asked, just a dog? The tendency towards bigger and grander is what likely kept filmmakers from making films in an isolated setting. But the second you say that it's based on Stephen King, then that's enough to appease them. Clearly. By then, moviegoers had already gotten Carrie, which was a commercial hit that garnered 2 Oscar nominations, as well as The Shining and Creepshow. When Cujo came out, the same year saw the release of The Dead Zone and Christine as well. Even then, they knew that Stephen King was someone that could sell tickets. This must be why they greenlit a project with such a minimalist story. The plot is not very complicated, but boy is it dense when you really dig into it. Stephen King, in his book on writing, said that Cujo is a book that he doesn't even remember writing. This is because Stephen King used to do a lot of drugs. You can tell by just how lean the book is. Other than a few subplots about cereal commercials and the ransacking of a woman's apartment by her lover, there really is not much else to it, other than the dog and his rabies.
Cujo.
Can he get us in here? Can he eat his way in here? Can he?
My God, I'm losing my baby.
Thematically, though, there is a lot going on. The woman's infidelity falls by the wayside as her maternal instincts kick in, as she must protect her son. That part is to be expected. The part that cannot be understated enough, however, is the motive of the dog, because whole pages in the book are dedicated to giving us Cujo's perspective, and it's not a good one. He starts off as a curious and friendly dog, but once he succumbs to his rabies, he becomes very different. He begins to hate everyone around him. He rages against them. He even rages against God, inasmuch as a dog even can have a concept of God. Cujo is basically Stephen King's militant atheist phase, where he uses a fictional rabid dog to explore his own existential anxieties. Cujo's internal monologue may not have come across in the film, but it does make it unique in the genre of natural horror in that it suggests a different motivation for the animal. This is suggested subtly by the movie, though, in the fact that Cujo doesn't seem to be killing to eat, or because he's protecting territory. Those are the two most common motivations in natural horror. But Cujo is in a third category altogether. He's sick. This changes everything in a way. It means that Cujo, as scary as he is just as likely to evoke pity. That pity definitely comes through in the book, and it's true to some extent in the movie as well. And what does it mean for the protagonist? Well, that's where the film and the book diverge. In the book, when she finally musters up the courage to fight Cujo and ultimately kills him, it's too late for her son, who dies of dehydration. As far as endings go, even though it is so painfully bleak, it is very fitting and easily one of King's best endings. And that's saying a lot because he's not exactly known for his endings. In the movie, however, it plays out like the final girl of slasher movies. She pays dearly for the sins of her infidelity, that is her moral reason for being here, as it unfortunately was for women in horror for quite a long time, from The Birds and Psycho on forward. But then she does what she must as a woman, and that is to protect her son. Nothing else matters. The dog is not doing this for any natural reason, like hunger or safety, and so it must be unnatural, from a certain point of view anyway. That means this is being done to our poor heroine for a reason. Cujo is great because it's Stephen King at his most comfortable. He likes when his characters are stripped of all pretense and resources and forced to reckon with their inner demons. He likes putting them in isolated settings, like in Misery, Gerald's Game, and The Shining. In fact, one of my favorite King novels is getting a film adaptation, and it could end up shaping the isolation horror genre for sure. The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon is a thin book about a 9-year-old girl that gets lost in the woods and comforts herself by thinking about her favorite baseball player, Tom Gordon. This book is a clever exploration of how an actual child might respond in a situation like this. I think I was personally moved by the story so much because I related to it. On one of my blogs, I recently recounted the story of when I got lost as a child while riding my bike around when I was a kid and how terrified I was. But importantly, this is yet another character-driven story where much of the horror is psychological and where most of the story happens internally. But when I look at a movie like Gerald's Game, a story that I would not have picked to adapt because of how much internal dialogue there is, its clear success makes me even more excited for this adaptation. And much like Cujo, a movie version of The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon might cement in the minds of filmmakers and horror movie fans the idea that isolation horror is really friggin' cool and really powerful stuff. This film would fall into the second category, though technically, I think, it's unique in the sense that even though the character is out in the wild, it's a little girl. It's hard to say she went looking for the danger in the same manner as some thrill-seeking spring breaker. I'm not surprised by this, though. Domestic isolation horror films are not that common. Domestic natural horror films are common, though. Think about Arachnophobia, where a typically exotic threat comes to the suburbs and literally invades people's homes. It's not, however, an example of isolation horror. Some films over the years have featured it in parts, and some of those moments are important for this discussion. The 1984 film Razorback opens with a wild boar breaking into a man's house and dragging his grandson out into the darkness to be eaten alive and never seen again. There was also that delightful made-for-TV movie back in the 90s called Strays, which is about a bunch of feral house cats that take over the house of some new homeowners. Now, house cats are not typically the subject of horror movies because, well, cats can be jerks. They don't tend to be very scary. But you gotta hand it to these filmmakers for at least trying. I mean, if ever there was a movie out there to actually make the effort to make house cats scary and present real house cats, this is the movie to check out, especially since the wife spends a good portion of the movie literally trapped inside with these monsters. So I guess you could say take it or leave it. But occasionally you get films about characters trapped in a crawl space with a bunch of hungry alligators. This makes for truly great drama. Now, I already talked about Crawl twice, and as much as it kills me, I will resist the urge to talk about it again. I will just say that what makes Crawl unique as an isolation horror film that takes place in a house is how modern the film is thematically. If this film took place 50 years ago, there would be some morally questionable character trait on Haley's part, and that trait would be the thematic catalyst and cause for the whole crisis. Instead, if anything, the father is the one that seems to be responsible for everything that happens, and Haley is just the one that saves the day. Think about the scene where she's talking to her sister. Her sister tells her that the hurricane is going to make landfall in her hometown, and Haley seems to be surprised by this. The hurricane didn't come because Haley was already going to see her dad, because she wasn't. This is why I think reading The Storm as an extension of Haley's feminine fury is a bit old hat. In short, the movie suggests that times have indeed changed. Moving on to the exotic isolation horror films, the film most responsible for kickstarting this now popular subgenre is definitely Open Water.
Daniel, where's the boat?
That's a good question.
We are stuck in the middle of the ocean. Oh, God. Oh.
It's okay. It's okay.
Oh, God, something's rubbing against my foot. Are you all right? Stay still. It's going to be okay.
It's hard for me to tell if this film is thought of more highly or less highly than it was when it originally appeared, though. At the time, I think I was largely impressed by the simplicity of the premise. This was around the same time as Phone Booth, and I recall thinking that Phone Booth was the only other film I could think of that took place in a single location while remaining exciting the whole time. I also remember a moment in one of my screenwriting classes where the teacher challenged us to think of an example of a film in which there was no conflict, or very minimal conflict, and for some reason I said this film. My classmates chuckled and kind of agreed, but by admitting that, they were also saying, without words, how much they disliked the film. And it kind of proves the point that you cannot have a film without conflict. It's hard to sustain a conflict that is man versus nature when nature doesn't actually do a whole lot. Not right away, anyways. The fact that this was based on a true story does give the film some leeway in this regard, but at the end of the day, it's just two people in water and not much happens. But then, 7 years later, we got another film with a nearly identical premise, and also based on a true story that fixes all of the apparent problems of Open Water, and that's The Reef.
What happened? Must have hit something. This boat's gonna sink. There's land over there, and that's where I think we should be going.
I fish these waters, mate. I know what's out there. I'm not getting in the water.
You're right about this.
You're not the only one.
Oh, it's a shark.
How big? It's big. Take some deep breaths with me.
The Reef is about 5 friends that find themselves stranded when their boat hits something and capsizes. They have to swim 12 miles through open water to an island they cannot even see because it's so far away. This film fixes a couple of problems from Open Water. For one, they have an achievable goal. They're not just sitting ducks. They also have more characters. This means we get more opportunity for shark action, but it also gives us a nice range of personalities and human emotion. Some characters start out brave, but end up chickening out, while the most terrified among them prove that they have that wonderful final girl essence in great supply. The best thing about this movie, though, is the thing I will always go on about, and that's getting to see the real-life shark. It's not a great white, or even all that big, but it is a shark, and notably, it acts just like I've always wanted to see sharks behave in movies. It doesn't attack right away, first of all. It follows them and seems to circle them, inching ever closer, and then swimming away. And just like you would expect from a shark, it waits until the characters are separated from the group and actually makes its move. Seriously, one gets the sense that they really did their research here. Or maybe it's not so much research as much as they just told the story of what actually happened. And that explains why The Reef seems to be so much more realistic. The pacing is also amazing, and everything seems to happen organically. Each death is powerful, and the tension never lets up until the agonizing final scenes. Then, in 2016, we got yet another incarnation of isolated shark movies with The Shallows, starring Blake Lively.
What did you say the name of this place was?
This is paradise.
This is an isolation horror film in which its character finds a secluded and unmapped beach in Mexico to go surfing, but finds herself stranded on a rock in shallow waters, which have a shark in them, and with only a wounded bird to keep her company. It's immediately obvious while watching this film that they pulled out all the stops in terms of visual effects. It's almost as if they tried to write scenes that would be difficult to film so that they could get incredibly beautiful shots. Much of what happens is pretty ridiculous and doesn't seem very plausible, but where the film took a step backwards from The Reef when it comes to the realism, it really ratchets up the entertainment value. I say all the CGI silliness and over-the-top finale is redeemable though because of one thing, the seagull. Now, you guys all know that I'm no fan of birds, and among them, we all know that seagulls are the worst. But by the end of this film, I wanted to take Steven Seagal home with me. I'm probably not alone there. Once again, I have to give props to the filmmakers for changing their minds on this one. They were originally going to go with either a puppet or CGI, but they discovered while on the set that seagulls can actually be trained. Blake Lively herself apparently developed a relationship with one of them, who came to be known as Sully, and you can see it on screen. It's probably my favorite thing about this movie, actually. There's even a scene where Lively tries to fix the bird's wing and gets bit, and apparently that bite was real. As far as the story goes, there's not much to it, unfortunately. There is the implication that the girl is leaning into her 20-something wanderlust as a means of not really wanting to confront her feelings about her mother's recent death. This doesn't really feel like it's the reason the movie exists, though. It feels like nothing more than a way to make the character relatable. You could say this makes the story a bit shallow. I wouldn't say it's the worst attempt to stitch together a character arc, but in terms of story, it may be a bit of a step back. Choosing to focus on the setting and the premise, though, definitely paid dividends. When a film like this grosses $120 million, you can bet that many more films like it will follow. And they did. I'm sure this is precisely why we got 47 Meters Down, which takes the whole premise of being isolated in shark-infested waters to a very extreme place.
Oh my god, this is amazing! Jeez!
What was that?
What? Oh my god! What's going on? Where's the game? Help! I have to get out of here! I can't breathe! I can't breathe! How deep are we? 47 meters. I'm so scared. We have to get back up to the top.
Like The Shallows, this film clearly cares more about convincingly showing a scary but very real place in all its high-definition glory. Scuba diving itself seems scary as it is, but at least it only usually happens in shallow waters where there's lots of pretty things to look at, like coral reefs and such. But the ocean floor, as it turns out, is pretty terrifying. It's dark, it's silent, and very cold. After seeing this movie, you probably wouldn't remember the names of these characters or why they thought this was a good idea, but I'll bet you remember the scene where one of them swims across a dark abyss to retrieve a flashlight. Seriously, that scene is bone-chilling. I even like the scene that I'm guessing many people hated, where the characters seem to escape, but then the film goes the whole occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge route and reveals that we're actually still at the bottom of the ocean. I don't actually think there's much of a common story thread in these films. I think all these characters ultimately learn to appreciate their own lives more, but that's pretty common in the horror genre in general. One could get the same lesson from a movie like Saw or Hostel, but the emphasis on presenting these simple stories in a much more fantastic way, with dazzling special effects and chilling cinematography, suggests that these are stories that aren't going anywhere. What may yet follow these films, I think, are films that are even more personal, and we are getting that. But having looked at the evolution of shark movies in the isolation genre, there's one other thread that I'd like to look at, which will cover a wide range of films in the genre, all of which fall under that exotic category, and those are what I can only describe as doomed lovers. Imagine my surprise, after having prepared everything for this episode up till this point. But then, subsequently, watching a few more isolation horror films to pad my Natural Horror November watches, and I discovered an interesting pattern in them. It's pretty fascinating, actually. The story goes like this. A couple decides to go out into the wilderness for some reason, and the man leads the way. It becomes clear at some point along the way that the husband or boyfriend doesn't actually know as much as he claims to know. Before the couple makes it into certain danger where they ultimately get lost, they meet another man who very clearly is an expert in the wilderness, but who is presented as, at best, a foil for the male protagonist, and at worst, an actual villain. The film moves quickly past this, though. Then the threat becomes more apparent, but only to him. He tells her that everything is fine, and she believes him. But then the moment of reckoning occurs, and there can be no mistaking it. They are lost, and there really is a dangerous creature following them, and it's all his fault. At this point, an interesting thing happens. She becomes more endeared to him, not less. She may be pissed, but the story seems to end the same way for her. They are in this together, and at the end of the day, a very long and painful day, she still loves him. Almost always, he realizes that, this all being his fault, he must do what he must to save the woman he loves, even if it kills him, as it almost always does. This basic structure exists to some degree in at least 6 movies that I'm going to be talking about. The first one I already talked about, and that's The Reef. This doesn't follow the template exactly, but both of its main male characters are looked to by their female lovers for guidance, and both are deceptive and ultimately responsible for their demise. In the first case, the man actually talks his girlfriend into making the 12-mile swim to safety, acting like it'll be perfectly fine. And in the second case, the other man, whose plan it was to make this trip in the first place, is at many points in the film seen hiding information of a very real shark in the waters. But if we go back 3 years to 2007, we see a better example of this story though, and that's Black Water.
You want to do some fishing? I can take you out.
It's the best time to fish. With all the extra water around, it's pretty lively on the river.
Is that why you bought a gun? What was that?
It's a fucking croc.
Get out! Get out of the water now!
This was a movie about a real-life crocodile attack that took place in the swampland of northern Australia, and it's an excellent example of isolation horror. In this one, the masculine tension between the woman's husband and the group's impromptu tour guide is very evident. The guide brings a gun, but fails to tell anyone why. When he's quickly killed off, thus kickstarting the events of the film, the husband is at every turn calling all the shots, and the women follow his lead. His ideas are less dangerous in this one, but he does end up paying for them, leaving the women to get themselves out of the mess. In fact, the story then shifts to the love between the two sisters, and the one that ultimately survives between them is, to me at least, a bit of a surprise. Then in 2009, there was The Canyon.
Hello! We're farther from the campground than when we started this morning. You're always pushing and you take stupid risks.
I asked if you were cool with this and you said yes.
We'll get you to a hospital first thing in the morning, okay?
I didn't know there were wolves around here.
You're here now.
Here we start to see that story come into focus more specifically. In this movie, a couple decides to have their honeymoon in the backcountry of the Grand Canyon, in a place where a person normally needs a professional guide with an actual permit. Being that it's late in the season and all the permits are sold, they link up with a sketchy-looking dude that promises to take them anyway. This guy epitomizes the male ego. A man that probably knows what he's doing, but is lazy, unsophisticated, and just plain risky. His drunkenness leads to him getting bit by a diamondback rattlesnake, a wound to which he ultimately succumbs. Until this happens, we would have absolutely no idea that this was a horror movie. Even the music, the occasional generic strings, sounds like it was ripped from a Ken Burns documentary, and all the visual jokes are cheesy, and the dialogue is a bit corny as well. But this just tricks us into letting our guard down, because what follows is pretty devastating. In this story, the husband can be somewhat forgiven for not knowing his way around the backcountry, but it was him that urged her to accept this as a good idea in the first place. He immediately begins to play it off like they will get out of this if they just do this or that thing. But as we will soon see, one of his decisions proves to be a very fatal mistake that takes a good part of the runtime of the movie to recover from. In fact, he all but gets removed from the story entirely, leaving the wife to suddenly assume her role as final girl badass. She alone keeps him alive, and manages to fend off several attacks from wolves that seem to grow hungrier by the minute. The thing that sets this movie apart from all the others is not that the woman ends up saving them, that much is not uncommon, but it is in how the circumstances bring her closer to the man she's trying to save, and in how far that faith takes her. This arc actually leads to a truly horrifying conclusion, and it makes the movie a true hidden gem. A year after this, the same year as The Reef, saw a film that I'm pretty sure is probably the most well-known non-shark movie in this category, and that's Frozen.
Last run, gotta make it count.
No one knows that we're up here.
This is so messed up.
Hello? Hey! It's Sunday, and they're not open again till Friday.
If we're up here all week, we're gonna die. Oh my god! Oh my god! I don't wanna die up here! Help!
This is about a trio of skiers that get left behind on a ski lift with no help expected for at least a week. They're forced to endure the elements until one of them decides to jump, but this proves to be a very stupid idea. This film really makes good use of its setting, and it really packs an unexpectedly emotional punch. The wolves in the film are very realistic too. We get so caught up in the story that we may not realize that when one wolf shows up and is easily shooed away, he shows up with all of his buddies later. When they circle their prey, it really seems like this is really happening. There are a few parts that feel a bit slow, as movies like this tend to be sometimes, but for the most part, it remains interesting from beginning to end. The film does show some of the same tropes, featuring men that think they know what they're doing, but ultimately are proven wrong. The female character is, once again, all too willing to accept what's been proposed to her by her male counterparts. This actually becomes a source of conflict when the other male character straight up blames her for their mutual friend's death because she didn't seem to protest more to his idea. I thought this moment, perhaps more than any other, was an interesting evolution in the doomed lover story. Then in 2014, we got Backcountry.
Hey, you're ready to go. Your canoe will be right down there by the water. Need a map?
No, I know this part well. Bear spray. You're not gonna need it.
I would be lucky to see anything bigger than a chipmunk.
Of course you're going that way.
This is the way.
No.
Were you just walking by, or?
She invited me up for a chat. I give Backcountry Eco Tours. Sure you don't need a guide?
I already have one.
You're a lucky man, Alex.
Alex,
I don't understand.
this can't be it, right? Can you look at me, please?
Just let me think. Let me think.
We don't have a map. We don't have a cell phone. We are in the middle of nowhere.
What is that?
Oh, that's acorns. It's falling from the trees on a tent. That's not an acorn.
This might be my favorite of all of these because the execution is outstanding. This movie, also terrifyingly based on a true story, is basically the template I described above to every last detail. I say this is the template because I think this is the apotheosis, if you will, of this type of movie. All the elements are there. This film is about a man that decides to take his girlfriend on a camping trip to the backcountry. Right off the bat, we know that he's going to be in trouble when he specifically rejects a map, claiming he knows the area inside and out. He means to take her to a specific spot in this wilderness, which is actually forbidden now by authorities, because of course it is. And for a while, so far so good. That is until they meet another man who claims to be a tour guide, but is presented to us as every bit untrustworthy as the tour guide in the canyon. He doesn't stick around long though, but his presence fulfills that great horror trope of the harbinger. Along the way to the spot they are headed to, there are signs of danger. The boyfriend knows very well that there is a bear in these woods, a fact he chooses to conceal from his girlfriend. When they finally arrive at wherever he believes the spot to be, they learn that they're actually lost. He has no idea where they are. In one moment, his ego shatters into 1,000 pieces, and she lets him have it. But not long after this, they make amends. This is important because it brings them closer together. It is clear that if they make it out of this alive, this is the man she wants to marry. It seems very strange that this would be the conclusion of a woman that is now in very certain danger because of this same foolish and arrogant man. But the beauty of the film is that at the same time, we kind of get it. He screwed up, but he's willing to die to pay for his mistake. The saddest moment is when the bear does arrive, and he sees it coming. He wants to lie to her again and tell her there's nothing out there, but he knows that this time he can't. And from that moment on, it's about nothing but survival. This is a brilliant film, and I highly recommend seeing it. If you see nothing else in this category, see this one. It also features a real live bear, by the way, who has an actual name. His name is Bart the Bear, and boy is he terrifying in this. I should also mention Into the Grizzly Maze for being in the same vein thematically. It also plays around with gender politics, featuring men whose masculinity is explored in relation to their ability and willingness to navigate the wilderness, and to a lesser extent the women who rely on them for better or worse. Oh, and it also features real bears, as well as Thomas Jane in yet another role that no one told me about. Finally, there's Outback, a movie from this year.
Where are we?
The Outback.
We're stranded and alone out here in the middle of nowhere.
We'll climb up that ridge. If we see something up there, we'll drive towards it. Be back in an hour.
Dingoes?
I don't know.
Nothing. No signal. Let's get back to the camper. Everything looks the same out here. This isn't the way we came. We'll get some rest. In the morning, we'll find the camper.
This one is about a couple that decides to vacation in the outback of Australia, but it's following some event in their relationship that has soured the mood. We eventually learn that he proposed to her on the plane over, but she turned him down in front of everybody. The movie is clearly echoing The Long Weekend when it comes to the couples fighting. It's clear, though, that this is not the common character of their relationship. They really do love each other. In this movie, as with all the others, a series of very poor decisions on the part of the boyfriend eventually lead them to a situation of deadly survival. There is not much by way of genuine horror, and one might simply mistake this for a drama with how much talking there is. The problem with the film, though, is in the nature of these mistakes. There are so many of them that it might make the viewer feel like the whole thing is contrived. As I've said before, I tend to be very forgiving of movies that attempt to show us the nature as she is, because it's easy to get it wrong. But sometimes, even I have to scratch my head and wonder, are they really going to do this and not that? The interesting thing, though, is that in spite of the many bad decisions that are made right up until the end, the actual story is very much in line with all the others. She reacts to his failure not with hatred, but with love. We learn that she said no to his proposal because she was afraid. She always loved him, but was afraid of marriage. Yet this ordeal has taught her that she couldn't imagine being with anyone else. Paradoxically, it makes her love him more. Now, given how idiotic he is, any woman watching this would likely be throwing popcorn at the screen. Her love does not feel earned in the way that it was in Backcountry. In fact, nothing feels earned, and that's the problem with this movie. Nevertheless, I don't think this type of story is going anywhere. I cannot speculate as to why this very conservative type of romantic survival story is showing up in our films, but perhaps, if we see more of them, we can learn why. Well, I hope that episode was as surprising for you as it was for me. As I said, that last part of this episode was the most recent thread to be added to these episodes, and so perhaps I'm way off base. I also chose to skip some interesting isolation horror films for the sake of time, as I have done with a lot of these episodes, but perhaps if other threads appear in the coming years, like the doomed lovers trope, it will give me an excuse to return to it. Now that we've seen how personal these films can be, I'm sure you'll agree that we're probably going to see a lot more of them. I have one more episode to go, and that one will likely be coming out on Monday because technically that's still November. I apologize for having fallen behind, but hey, at least I got 6 out of my 7 episodes planned, and that's not too bad. Once again, check out our blog, anatomyoffear.com, and email us at anatomyoffearpodcast@gmail.com if you want to let us know what you think. And like us on Facebook too. We love to engage with people over there. I hope you all have a happy Turkey Day, and I'll see you soon. Be safe.